I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you, Ruth Wisse, to the Israel Connection on JA Community Radio. For our listeners, I must point out that this is the culmination of quite a lot of effort to get this to happen today. Here we are in April. I think I approached you initially in September of 2020. You were busy and encouraged me to contact you in the new year, which I did. We almost cracked it about a month ago, but your dear husband unfortunately had to visit hospital at the last minute, and I was greeted by half a dozen emails as I woke up in the morning to begin to prepare my last efforts to get the interview to kick into gear. And but here we are today, and it's actually happening. I can hardly believe it.
Well, you can imagine I'm happier still because it tells me that everything is okay here at home. So, it's in a good hour, as one would say in Yiddish.
And we both have our respective bookcases behind us.
Yes, so it seems.
So let's
the same books.
I wanted to start off with the book that you wrote about 14 years ago, a remarkable book, which is really what introduced me to you and the giant that you are in the Jewish world. A book that celebrates the Jewish return to sovereign power in all its promise and complexity. It's a resounding, fighting book that contains much information in just a few pages and offers a simple argument. Zionism is potentially the solution to Jewish powerlessness. Israel is the guarantor of our safety as Jews. Further, the Jewish nation's resumption of sovereignty in 1948 created opportunities for the Jews to bring benefits to humanity as a whole. Now, this book, as I said, is 14 years old. Would you say it's as relevant and up to date as when it was first published 14 years ago?
Well, perhaps it is not for me to say, but for others to say, but I would argue if it's even more relevant today because the essential analysis that I try to offer holds firm and more. All that you say in description of the book is exactly what I do try to point out, but it's a little bit more complicated than that because what I also include in the book is that although Zionism was an answer, the best answer that Jews could provide at the time to the problem of anti-Semitism as they saw it, and of course, to their own needs of having to reconstitute a state that they had been longing for 2,000 years. The time had come at the end of the 19th century when all kinds of countries were establishing their own national sovereignty. So it was high time for the Jews to do it as well. And I think that, the establishment of the State of Israel, we could go into it longer, but I think it is one of the greatest of accomplishments of a people in history, not just of the Jews in their history. However, I do point out that it was not at all the answer to anti-Semitism that the Zionists had hoped it would be, because anti-Semitism turns out to be not about the Jews at all. Anti-Semitism is carried by anti-Semites. It has to do with who they are, their needs, the functions that they're looking for in a political ideology. And as it happened, the pursuit of the Jews or the organization of politics against the Jews in their own homeland turned out to be at least as convenient, if not even more convenient as a political weapon than the organization of politics against the Jews in dispersion had been. What I tried to show is that there is no second guessing Herzl and the Zionists. From their perspective at the time, they were perfectly justified in thinking that the answer lay in the problem of dispersion, that if Jews could finally reconstitute themselves as a normal people in their own homeland with their own central political authority, and with means of self-defense, well, that would, make them a member of the community of nations. Why would there be any problems after that? You see, it was a perfectly logical assumption. But what they could not see is that when the Arab League got together in 1945, the same year that Hitler went down in his bunker, the Arab countries would find, in opposition to the Jews as a people, the same opportunity that the German founders of anti-Semitism had found in organizing their politics against the Jews. So what I try to urge is that we look at the organization of politics against the Jews, if we call it anti-Semitism, or as it has become, anti-Zionism, we look at its function, at its political function in the political life of those who use it. And this brings us to many questions that you raise about Holocaust museums, about other attempts to stop anti-Semitism, about definitions of anti-Semitism, and so on. I would always return to the question of who benefits, how do they benefit, why are they doing this, why are they resorting to it, how does it serve their purpose? And if we begin to understand that, I have to admit, it doesn't necessarily help us stop anti-Semitism, but we can't stop it unless we do understand it. So this is something that I try to emphasize, that just because you can accurately define and understand and explain a problem does not mean that you can solve it. I can, let's say, explain the problem of starvation in a country or something. It doesn't necessarily mean that I will have the power to stop it. But unless I can explain it adequately, I certainly would not be able to go to the next step of stopping it.
Yeah, well, certainly what has happened is that Jews, by having founded the State of Israel, have made themselves a larger target for anti-Semites. And you have preempted what we will get to talk about perhaps a little bit later on in our conversation today, where we'll bring up the issue of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and Holocaust education in dealing with anti-Semitism. But just still on the matter of your book, of course, you're no longer the Martin Peretz Professor of Yiddish Literature and Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. That's on the jacket of the book. So that's that needs to be adjusted. But one of the biggest events, I suppose, that's occurred in the last 12 months that you probably didn't anticipate so much in your book is the advent of the Abraham Accords. And do you think that this makes a major change to what you've said in the book?
Well, obviously, it does change the situation, and it changes it, I think, in ways that are perfectly obvious. But it does go back to my to the way that I see politics evolving. The countries that have decided to make peace with Israel, and not make only a cold peace with Israel, but as it seems, they really want to cooperate. They really want to coexist with Israel in a creative way. Those countries have reached a certain point of development in their own self-realization. In other words, you can tell which countries are democratizing. You can tell which countries are developing the possibilities of coexistence, the acceptance of pluralism, the acceptance of a kind of toleration. You can tell the first sign of it will be the ability to coexist with, to exchange diplomacy with, to trade with, to take advantage of the existence of the Jewish state. And those countries that are incapable of doing it will be the entities and the countries with the leadership that still most needs to organize their politics against, to organize a politics of grievance and blame, because they're not yet ready to deal with their own problems. They're still not ready to develop a kind of a proto-democratic system in their own midst. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
That that this is why I think that it has changed the landscape tremendously, and of course I think for the good. But I think that it's for the good not just of Israel; it's for the good of those countries. It tells us that Morocco, for example, is ready for what we knew it might be ready for, but never manifested that. It tells us that the United Arab Emirates are ready to really enter the Western world as a competitor, as a cooperative entity. You see what I mean? It's so interesting that there's an exact correlation between the ability to accept the Jews and to accept the Jewish state and the degree of democratization within a polity.
And one of the things you described in your book, Jews and Power, is the impact of the change in the power balance in the Middle East, where we've seen Israel emerge as the most powerful country in the region militarily and economically. Now, how significant has this been in defining the position of Jews in relation to power, both in Israel and globally?
Well, again, a really good question, but it all depends on how you see power. Now, the Jews have developed a high degree of military power, and that's recognized. And it's not just the size of the military, but it's the ingenuity of the military and the continual alertness and inventiveness of the military. It never stops, and it can't stop, because let's face it, the minute Israel ceases to be what you call the most powerful country in the region, it won't exist. So it's not an option for Israel. If it does not maintain its military superiority, it simply will be destroyed. So unfortunately, it's still in the position of having to be as powerful in military terms as it is. It's not the choice of anyone in the country. I don't think Israel ever set out to be militarily powerful. In fact, it was very, very slow in developing its armed forces and in developing the idea that it would have to have a strong military. But it has no option. That is really the sine qua non. That is the condition, the basic condition of its existence. But here's the other part of it. Power also depends on the power you're willing to project and the power you're willing to use. Now, the policy of self-restraint of Israel, which is greater even than the policy of self-restraint of the United States or of any other country that I know, that policy is a kind of a brake, B-R-A-K-E, a stop on its perceived power, because its enemies know that, for example, it's not going to go and bomb cities at random. It's not going to use its people as human shields. It's not going to go to the lengths that other countries will go in using a weaponry that it can develop. They count on Israel's high degree of moral restraint as a sign of its weakness, as a sign of its vulnerability. And they use it to advantage whenever they can. So I think that Israel is in a really rough situation. It knows it. The citizens know it. They know that their lives are complicated by their morality. Every soldier knows that because they know how they're trained They know how carefully they have to avoid, even in a situation of warfare. They can't just go in and storm the cities of their enemy, which have been constructed so as to entrap them, because they know that these people are not going to try to kill innocent women and children. You see what I mean? So the word power, like all this vocabulary, has to be refined, and we have to understand what constitutes power, and the extra problems that Israel and that the Jewish people run into in exercising even the power that they do enjoy and have.
There's one thing that I think I have to ask you at this point, because I interviewed Professor Raphael Cohen-Almagor, who's a professor of at University of Hull, and he expressed a view which I've heard many, many times, that the Jews in Israel have the power, and consequently they hold the reins when it comes to the ability to bring about a resolution to this dispute, which is really the thing that's hanging around our necks all the time, this Israel-Palestine dispute. The Jews have the power, the Palestinians are powerless. This is the way it's expressed. So we are, the onus is on us, according to many left-wing views, that we have to recognize that we can do something to resolve this dispute, but we're not doing it. How do you respond to that, Ruth?
Well, my short view is it's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And the fact that it's a widely held view does not make it any less stupid and ignorant. And I would say that if you want to understand the degree of its stupidity, then you should do what I would say one ought to do at the beginning of every single discussion, let alone argument, over Israel in the Middle East. What I always advise students in particular, but we are all students of this question, get out a map of the Middle East. Never engage in a discussion of this situation if you do not have a full-scale map of the Middle East. And if you have a full-scale map of the Middle East, then you will see that the initial war against Israel, launched by the Arab League in 1948, right, but prepared for already in 1945, which is still active, despite the fact that some of the countries have made peace. The Arab League as a league is still at war with the state of Israel. And this is the longest war, I think, that certainly the longest current war. And it is the most lopsided war in history. That map will tell you everything. If I may just touch the tip of the iceberg here, let's see what we're talking about. Egypt, 370,000 square miles. Iraq, 169,000 square miles. Okay, Syria, 71,000 square miles. Yemen, so 203,000 square miles, and so on. If you take a look at the 5-point-something million miles of territory that the Arabs control, and those countries refused to accept the presence of a Jewish state of any size. They refused the partition of Palestine, and they insisted on keeping the Palestinians homeless, as they still intend to do forever, because that is their weapon, their constant weapon against the Jewish state. That's what they use as the moral stick. That's what they use as the political organizing instrument. So the Palestinians have to be kept homeless. The perpetual refugees, as it were. Who keeps them refugees? It's certainly not Israel. Israel would do anything to see to it that the Palestinian Arabs live well and are happy and are productive and are as well off as they are. Does Israel need enemies? Israel doesn't need enemies, but the Arab countries need enemies. And they have unfortunately, they have cast the Palestinians in this role. And very unfortunately, Palestinian leadership has accepted that role. And they have turned the Palestinians, and the Palestinians have turned themselves into a kind of, I can't even, very sadly, a terrifyingly pathological people. Here they live alongside a creative, dynamic society. In 1948, you know, the Palestinians were regarded as the most creative part of the Arab people. Everyone knew that. They were the smartest, they were the most adaptable, they were the kind of the proto-Jews of that country. Now look at them. What have they invented? What have they done? Because whereas they live near a society of builders, they have turned themselves into a society of destroyers. And I must say that everyone who holds the opinion that the Jews owe them something and that the Jews can solve the Palestinian problem and that the Jews can solve the Arab problem are really contributing to the problem. They are actually creating the problem by pretending that this lie, can be resolved through a fiction. So, yeah, every Jew would love to believe that if only, we've always been like that. Oh, you know what, said the Jews, if only you cut off your beard and if only you start learning German properly, well, you will be accepted. If only you learn French and you become members of the military, of course you'll be accepted, et cetera, et cetera. Jews have always tried to blame themselves for the war against them. Well, it can't be done. I mean, we can keep doing it, and many Jews will continue to do it, and many others will do it for us. But I would say that it is evil to hold the Jews responsible for the aggression against them. And it is stupid, yes, but the difference between evil and stupidity is sometimes very hard to draw the line. One wants to say, well, people are ignorant, they don't understand, they don't know. Well, professors should know and understand. If a child of 5 says something, I have to say, well, it's just a child of 5 doesn't understand. But when professors and people who study politics and who could look at the map of the Middle East, right, they know where to find it. They know what it looks like. When they look at that and they see that reality and they say, oh, if only Israel moved 5 yards this way or 10 yards that way, or gave up this aspect of Jerusalem, or did this or did that, that would solve the problem. When the only reason that Jews have that land in the first place is because of the aggression against them. That's the only reason they have that extra territory that should have been theirs perhaps to begin with, but they didn't take it until they were attacked. So that tells you everything. What happens as a consequence of the war could not therefore retroactively have become the cause of the war. So I would dismiss these things out of hand, except unfortunately, to dismiss them, you have to have your own set of arguments, you have to have your own conviction, and you have to have your own moral confidence to make those arguments.
Well, thank you very much for that commentary on that particular point. You certainly haven't minced words there, Ruth, in what you've just said. Well, let's bring it back to us as Jews now and look at what's happening in the United States in particular, where we've got a large number of Jews in the Biden administration, which is now it's just gone beyond its 100th day in office. Is this something that we can celebrate, that we have such a large number of Jews representative of the American administration? Doesn't really, though, depend on what kind of Jews these are who are in the government in the United States?
Yes, well, of course. I mean, that's the opportunity, and that's also the big problem. Jews are, let's put it this way, Jews are not like blacks, like African Americans. African Americans are also not monolithic by any stretch of the imagination. And one forgets that. There's a tremendous range of differentiation within the African American community, but they can't change their color. So an African American will be recognized as an African American, and many of them will have to react politically to the condition in which they find themselves. Jews are in a different position altogether. Many Jews feel that the word Jewish is fungible. It doesn't have to be religion. It doesn't have to be nationality. It can be something as abstract as, a wish to make a better world. That's what a Jew really is. And you can say, look, I'm a good Jew, and then you can redefine Judaism into something else. Well, this has been done. It's been done not only by the early Christians who took Judaism and said, look, we're the real Jews. We are the real Jews because we are realizing what is really just there in Judaism, but it hasn't been fully expressed. It hasn't been fully released, and we're its real manifestation. And it was done by the communist Jews, right? And by the socialist Jews who said, listen, this is what Judaism has been pointing to all along. It's been pointing to this kind of economic egalitarianism, and we're the ones who are realizing it. So you have all kinds of possibilities within the word Jewish, and all of those are being tried out, if you will, in the United States of America. And I would also say that there is a rule of thumb, a political rule of thumb. And that is the following, that the more politics are organized against the Jews, in other words, the more anti-Jewish feeling and force there is in a society, the more Jews will capitulate to the other side. And they won't just join the enemy, but they will try to prove that Jews are responsible for the hatred against them. And therefore, they will blame their fellow Jews, just as you pointed out in that example that you gave before. If only the Jews did this, if only they did that. So unfortunately, the Jews who are in the Biden administration are in many cases apologists for the Jews. They're not identified with a strong Jewish religious identity. They're not identified with a strong pro-Israel commitment. They're in no way deeply immersed in that magical combination of Judaism, of peoplehood and religion and culture and so much else. They don't have the education in many cases. And what they do can be either neutral or it can be positively harmful. I won't even talk about Antony Blinken, although I wrote an article about him, which we could get into. But let's just take Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States. Her husband went on television to tell everyone what Hanukkah was. Hanukkah, which is the most nationalistic holiday on the Jewish calendar. Oh no, for him, it was just an ecumenical holiday like a Christmas with a Star of David, a Christmas with a Star of David. Not a word about the origins of Hanukkah, not a word about the Maccabees, not about a word about the fight for freedom and what Hanukkah actually represents in human history. No, he reconfigured Hanukkah as a Christian holiday. And basically, they are the great exemplars of what liberalism can attain. What is a higher aspect of liberalism than a Christian and a Jew marrying and being nothing together, right? That's who they are. And but that's not who they are now privately for themselves, which, they can do whatever they like. But they are now advertising that as Judaism. And you know how many uneducated Jews there are in the country, let alone uneducated others about Judaism. So you see, this this idea that Jews are now very much in the administration and so forth, it can work both ways, and unfortunately, it can be a very debilitating phenomenon.
Yes, they happen to be Jews, but they're not really Jewish, is the way I might describe it. What I want to lead on to from what we've just been saying is Jews have a lot of cultural power in the United States, in society. There's a focus, though, very much on discrimination of ethnic minorities in American society, and emphasizing the culture of these minorities. We've seen the evolution of Black Lives Matter, and I've been listening to the case on radio this morning of the trial of the police officer who was involved in that terrible incident in May last year. Now, the trouble with all this is that the Jews are being included into the group that are deemed to have what we call white privilege. So isn't there a real danger now for Jews who find themselves being bundled together with the so-called oppressors of society that people are out there talking so much about?
Yes, well, it goes back to what we began, what we were saying at the beginning of this discussion, and that is, what is all this about? You see in the United States growing a very dangerous politics of grievance and blame. It exists among many minority groups that have tried to mobilize a politics of grievance, a politics of blame, as a way of gaining power, more power for themselves. In the university, this has come to be known as intersectionality. And what this has manifested itself in is the following, that you have the women's movement, or now forces within the women's movement, saying, we are the aggrieved. We are being brutalized by men. You certainly have Black leaders, African-American leaders, saying, look, we are still suffering the results of slavery. There is systemic racism that has not disappeared in the United States, despite the fact that the civil rights laws were passed in 1964. Things are worse now than they ever were, and they take incidents which are all too horrifying in themselves, but they blow them up into a politics which is entirely based on false information and lies. So that's a second group of grievance and blame. Then you have things like the movement of gays and lesbians and sexual choice, where they also say, look, we're the ones who are the oppressed. And you suddenly get a coalition of forces, all of whom identify with victims, with victimhood. And of course, the Jews do not figure as these victims. And we can say why the Jews are so conveniently now targeted by this movement, as saying, look, you are not the victims, you are the victimizers in this. Look at you, you're the wealthy. Well, this is a very old politics. This is how anti-Semitism began in the 1870s in the first place. Oh, said the leaders of this movement, you want to know why you're poor? It's because the Rothschilds have your money. You want to know why you're unemployed? It's because the Jews have your jobs. Oh, you want to know why no one goes to church anymore? It's because the Jews have taken over the culture. Don't you see they're leading the orchestras? Don't you see they're now the journalists? Don't you see they're now the lawyers? That movement of grievance and blame organized itself as anti-Semitism. The Jews are responsible for what we cannot achieve. This movement of grievance and blame in the United States is very much like that, even though it is now not exclusively focused on the Jews. It says white America. But you see, preposterously enough, it has chosen the Palestinians as the emblem of the aggrieved. Now, where did that come from? You know how many aggrieved people there are in the world, of whom the Palestinians are the best off because they happen to be right alongside the state of Israel? And yet they choose the Palestinians so that that can be the flag under which they march. And it becomes really very largely, at least in some parts of the country, an anti-Jewish movement, an anti-Israel movement. Now, from a logical point of view, I mean, if you try to explain this and you do it defensively and you try to explain, but the Jews are not this, but the Jews are not that, you'll never get anywhere. The only way of doing it is to show what is the function of this grievance and blame. What is its political function? How does it work? Why do they use it? What do they think they're getting for it? And how do they harm the people who use it? Because obviously, if you provide the wrong answer for the real question, if you provide the wrong solution for the real problem, you only make it worse. So anti-Semitism in Europe, had the Jews actually been responsible for the ills of Germany, then to say the Jews, the Jews, the Jews would have solved the problem. But of course, the Jews were the farthest thing from the causality of all that was really ailing Germany and Austria and Poland and France and, by the way, the Netherlands and all the countries within which anti-Semitism became prominent. So you see, by pointing at the wrong solution, by saying it's the whites, by saying it's systemic racism, by giving the wrong answers, you really exacerbate the problem. You make sure that it cannot be alleviated. And so one dares not accede, one dares not go along with these explanations.
Yes. Anyway, that's a whole area that we could move into, which takes us away, though, from my focus on Israel in particular, which is the main mandate of what I talk about on my show, The Israel Connection. I want to bring things back to your book, Ruth, and you've highlighted this dichotomy in your book, which is the dichotomy between the Gush Emunim, the right-wing settlers, as these people refer to them as, and Peace Now in their approach to the resolution of the Israel-Palestinian dispute. Now, you wrote, I quote, "The first group professed to satisfy the will of God, and the second the will of the Arabs. The first assertion was not subject to proof, and the second was demonstrably bogus. Your statement shows Israelis to be between a rock and a hard place. The second group has the weight of world opinion on its side, as we have seen when Israel indicated that it might annex parts of Judea and Samaria last year, and there was just a huge furor brewing when that looked like it could happen. How is this internal wrangle that's going on within Israel going to pan out, do you think?"
Well, I very much trust the population of Israel. Left to its own devices, it does extremely well. I think that Jews tend to know how to solve their own problems, and that is because they are a self-accountable people. So even though there are these splits in the country between those who think that a greater degree of accommodation will get you further and those who think that a greater accommodation will get you further, back, will retard you further, there will always be these arguments in healthy societies between a liberal and a conservative point of view. And in societies under siege, there are bound to be differences of opinion about what strategies will prove to be more effective than others. I'm sure these are arguments that rage in every part of the military in Israel, in the scientific community in Israel, in the school system of Israel and so forth. I mean, to some extent, this is healthy. It's like we ourselves are made up of, as the Talmud has it, Hillel and Shammai. You know, the person who wants to be lenient and the person who has to be authoritative and demanding. So, to some extent, I would say that we don't want a monolithic society. We don't want a society with everybody has one point of view. Those are totalitarian societies, and they only have one point of view because they're forced to have one point of view. So I am not worried as long as Israel is left to its own devices. What worries me, to get back to our point, and I don't know how it is in Australia, what worries me is that some Jews in America are going to ask Israel to sacrifice itself for their comfort. They are going to think that, if Israel takes what it calls a hard line, that's going to make me look bad in my society. So they're going to say to the Israelis, oh, you have to be more peace loving. Oh, you have to be more accommodating, because in my gym or in my boardroom or in my laboratory, right, that's what people want of me. So I have to force you to do that. I am very worried about the adverse effect of some Jewish anti-Jewish, Jewish anti-Zionism, which is beginning to develop in Israel, in the United States, in reaction to the actual anti-Zionism. So I would say that it's a very good thing that Israel says that any Jew who wants to become a citizen of Israel may become a citizen of Israel, but the Jews outside the country, including Israelis who now no longer are in the country, cannot vote. I think that's wonderful. I think that should never change. You know, that we can support Israel from the outside. We should do our maximum to do it, but we should never be given the vote, never be given the dea. You know, we should never be given the right to make the law, or to really, in any sense, change the direction of Israeli society.
Yes, certainly there's so much pressure being brought to bear on Israel and us as Jews as we go about what we do in the diaspora, that obviously some of it has to penetrate. But I think what you're saying there is that we can't yield on certainly very many important principles. What I want to allude to now and congratulate you, Ruth, is in relation to the Tikvah Leadership Conference that just happened about a month ago. Now, you're one of the key founders of Jewish Studies in the North American Academy. You've taught generations of students at McGill and Harvard universities, and for the last decade at the Tikvah Fund. Your achievements as a scholar and of literature and East European Jewish civilization have captured the whole of the modern Jewish mind in all its richness and depth. But you're much more than a teacher or scholar, and you've bravely stood up for Jews and the Jewish state in the arena of public debate. And this time around, you've won the Herzl Prize that was offered by the Tikvah Leadership Conference. And you delivered your Herzl Prize address, which focused on what you've learned about Jewish politics and Jewish power from Theodor Herzl. I certainly commend people who are listening to this to go and watch your address, but I also would commend that they go and watch a number of the other talks that were given at the Tikvah Leadership Conference. One of my favorites there being the one of Caroline Glick's, who really sums up where American Jewry stands and what the serious split is in American Jewry, which is a topic that I hope to cover in some of my future programs. But maybe you want to say a bit about this conference and how you feel it went.
Well, it was the first time that the conference had to be on Zoom. And well, that could take us into all the advantages and disadvantages of this form. It was always wonderful to have these conferences. This is, I think, the third or fourth one, to get together and to see that there are so many like-minded people. It is very reinforcing to be among people who share your basic anxieties and who share your basic hopes and commitments. But here you had thousands of people, which you could not get together in a hotel in New York as easily. So there was that excitement about it, that there were many, many people who were participating in the conference, many listeners, and many people who became involved in Tikvah as a result of this. I thought the conference was absolutely wonderful. From the opening where Pompeo spoke, where he was being interviewed and gave a very, very strong set of answers to the question that Roger Hertog posed to him about American foreign policy and about American foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel. And then there were discussions of family, of the Jewish family, of nationalism, of the importance of Jewish nationalism. What Tikvah is trying to develop, and what it is developing, is a sense of Jewish conservatism. The understanding that Judaism is built on the idea of a covenant, and that it is built on the idea of transmission of a very, very precious and complicated civilization, beginning with the Bible and developing into the Talmud and developing into Talmudic civilization, and all the way to the literature that I teach, modern Yiddish and modern Hebrew literature, which becomes sort of a part of that tradition. So the teaching of that and the transmission of that as part of the American fabric, and the idea that there is something so important about these fundamental principles and these institutions, and the idea of having to teach them at the highest level. This is something that Tikvah has really developed as its own mission. And the conference is really the place where all of it comes together, but it's done basically on a daily basis by its publication, Mosaic, the website, the Jewish Review of Books. And there are a whole series of courses. I don't know whether your listeners know that, but they're all accessible. If I may say so on my own behalf, I have 2 courses which are already out there, I think. One is on Daniel Deronda, 8 lectures on Daniel Deronda, and then also on the stories of Tevye the Dairyman by Shalom Aleichem. These are a series of lectures that one originally gave to a Tikvah audience, but they were given with the idea that they would be put together as a freestanding course for everyone who would then be able to use them. Well, Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik, who is really a genius of a young rabbi, he is giving a whole series of courses. Dan Polisar is giving a series of courses on Zionism. So I would say that Tikvah has become a really important resource, and the conference is one sign of it.
Yeah, it was really fabulous, and I think that this is what is benefiting us now that we're in so much more of an online world, that the accessibility to so much of what you've been mentioning is out there for all of us to benefit from. Now, I'm coming up to a big question, I think, which will round off what we've been talking about. And this is what really brought me to seek out to talk to you, which was an essay I read in the publication National Affairs that you wrote a couple of years ago, The Dark Side of Holocaust Education. And although this is not on Israel per se, I find it so significant what you had to say and how it relates to us in our Jewish communities everywhere, that I want you to perhaps summarize what concerns you expressed there. And then related to perhaps what's going on in our very own community when it comes to dealing with the issue of the Holocaust and its education.
Okay, well, this will have to be the this will, yes, our
no doubt
finale. But I think it is probably one of the most important subjects we can touch upon. Why? Because this is something that we Jews actually control. The subject of anti-Semitism that we've dealt with, and of Israel, is really not altogether in our hands to control. But what we do with Holocaust education and what we do with Holocaust commemoration is definitely within our power and our power to change. Now, I think that we Jews in the diaspora, and especially in English-speaking countries, have made a tremendous error, a very poor, very bad error of judgment. And there are reasons for it, which are understandable, but it doesn't change the fact that it was a terrible mistake and it has to be corrected. And the mistake is this: Jews mourn their dead. We still mourn the destruction of the temples. We mourn all the Jews who have been killed in our history. We are in no danger of forgetting our dead. And I think that all the commemoration that we do, and all the archival work that we do, and all the research we do, all of that is valuable. And that, as in Yad Vashem, and in that part of the Memorial Museum of the Holocaust in Washington, those things are extraordinarily important. The record has to be kept as fully, as religiously, if you will, as possible. However, the idea of putting in the center of the United States of America, on the Washington Mall, a Holocaust museum, that is crazy. Is that how we want to present ourselves to the world? So I would like to just very quickly point out the many things that are wrong with it. One is that it presents the Jews at the lowest point in their history. The Holocaust or the German destruction of European Jewry was the greatest humiliation, not just destruction, in the life of the Jewish people. That is how you want to present yourself to the Western world, through cadavers? And especially since in that same decade of the 1940s, this same Jewish world had built this infrastructure to regain its national sovereignty in a country that had been under foreign occupation for 2 millennia. Instead of telling the story that we tell at Passover, that we started as slaves, but look at us. We emerged into freedom. We emerged into Sinai to accept the commandments and to carry them forth. We tell the first part of the story, and we think that that is something that we can teach, that will tell something to the world. So I think that the emphasis on Holocaust in that sense was a disastrous error. First of all, because of the way in which it represents the Jewish people, falsely, completely falsely. It tells the German story. The triumph of anti-Semitism over the Jews is what the Holocaust actually shows. Whereas the rise of the state of Israel and the infrastructure of the Jewish communities, and what the Jewish communities were like, and what the Jewish community showed itself to be like, that is the story that one goes to with the world. So that's number one. Secondly, you can see how this teaching of victimology has really has done some damage to the country. If you see this competition in victimhood in the United States today, you can say, well, where did this originate? Well, certainly one of the contributing causes is a Holocaust story. The Holocaust, there should be Holocaust education. Everyone should learn about the Holocaust. Well, why should the Jews be represented as the big victims? We're the bigger victims. They're not the victims. So there is now this competition of victimology, trying to take the Jews down and say, oh, but look, this is real slavery. Look, this is real suffering. Look, poverty and inequality, that is real, and so on and so forth. Thirdly, let's go. Who has ever tried to educate people through showing death and murder? Education, when you want to educate the young morally, what you do is you teach them the foundations of morality. You teach them, Jewish education for children didn't even used to begin with the book of Genesis. It used to begin with the book of Leviticus. And in the United States, there's so much to teach: the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, the whole history of the country. You teach the glory of the civilization. You do not tell children, take them to show them, to teach them the Holocaust, thinking that this is going to make them more moral people. Who has ever suggested that teaching death and destruction is going to make you more sympathetic? Why shouldn't it make you more sadistic? So I think that the whole concept of Holocaust education is so poorly understood by the Jews. Now, as I say, we can understand it. The survivors felt that their story had never been told, that they had been signed. They wanted to tell their story to the world. They wanted it known. They wanted to speak for the dead. Yes, among ourselves, we haven't even begun to do the work that there is to be done. But to do that in front of the world, to say that that's the message we want to bring you, that we want you to, of all the things that we want you to learn about the Jews, we want you to learn about the Holocaust. Look, we made a mistake. And the faster we can change that, evolve it into something else, to change a Holocaust museum into a museum of the Holocaust and the rebirth, or the regeneration of Israel. It has to, the emphasis has to be shifted away from the destruction to the creation. We are a people, we are a startup nation. We are a nation of builders. We are a nation of belief, of faith. We have a tremendously strong civilization. We don't want to teach about German civilization. We want to teach really about our civilization. And we have to have the strength and the confidence to go out and do that.
And what you've been saying has been echoed largely by somebody else who's an important commentator. I'm referring to Melanie Phillips, who said that the unfortunate fact is that Holocaust education and memorializing have become a kind of a fig leaf, enabling some people to signal their virtue by lamenting dead Jews while displaying indifference or worse to the live ones. A good summary from her about this. I also want to mention that we just had Israel celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut, and in the context of where focus goes the wrong way, I listened to Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, talking about Israel's Yom Ha'atzmaut. And I can't understand why, on a day where he should be extolling the wonders of what Israel has achieved, he spent half the time mentioning anti-Semitism, which he should have talked about perhaps on Yom HaShoah or on or a Holocaust Remembrance Day. So what do you make of somebody doing?
Well, I think we have to pave the way. We have to show the way. And if we change the emphasis, then perhaps others will follow our lead in that.
Just want to ask you, this letter that I've received from our Jewish Holocaust Centre in Melbourne, what is your opinion about it? With no mention of anti-Semitism, do you think it's paving the right way? It's of course appealing to our own community. So, do you think it's going in the right direction?
Well, it's not for me to criticize the Australian Jewish community, but I would say that what I said about the Holocaust Museum here and what I said when I lived in Montreal about the Holocaust Museum there, I don't believe in them. I don't like them. I don't believe in them. I don't think they're productive, and I worry that they may be destructive. If there are to be central institutions that tell the story of the Jewish people, we ought to use the Passover Haggadah as our template. You start with slavery, you start with that. If you want to tell the story of the Holocaust, you begin there. But the story you tell is the rebuilding of the state of Israel, the eternity of the Jewish people, Jerusalem from its origins to the present, the Talmud coming out of the Bible and how the Bible served the world. You build a Bible museum. Why should others have built the Bible museum and not the Jews? It's funny that the Christians had the courage to build a Bible museum in Washington, and the Jews built the Holocaust Museum. Well, Christianity believed in showing Jesus on the cross. They thought that was a redemptive story. The Jews never thought that Jesus on the cross was their redemptive story. They put the Torah up front, and that's what they put up front and kept up front. So to change that into our sort of competing with Jesus on the cross, to sort of say, well, we are a whole people that was sacrificed on the cross history, I think does not serve the purpose of the Jewish people as I see it. So I would urge a change of emphasis to the degree that it's possible. It can be done slowly, it can be done incrementally, but I think that Jews should become aware that they've got to change the emphasis, both in the teaching of their own children and in their presentation of themselves to the world. It's been really a great, great pleasure and privilege to speak with you.
Oh, it's my privilege. It's all my privilege, and I think it'll be to the benefit of the people who are listening, and anybody who is watching this or listening to this who hadn't heard about Professor Ruth Wisse before. I think we've rectified that in one foul swoop.
Thank you so much. Thank you. More power to you. Bye-bye.
Bye.